The air smelled like fresh-cut grass. But for Lily Thompson, it was a sickening reminder of the day ahead. The sun hung high in the sky, baking her skin as she clutched her daughter's hand, her pulse racing. The Thompson family had just moved into a modest house in the affluent neighborhood of Brookwood, and it was supposed to be a new beginning, one far away from the suffocating noise of their old apartment in the city. As they stepped out of their car, a white neighbor across the street, Mrs. Jenkins, stood on her porch, eyes narrow, lips curling into a thin line. "You people don't belong here," she sneered, the word spat with venom. Lily froze, her heart pounding in her chest. Before she could respond, a car sped by, its driver honking in mockery. Mrs. Jenkins smirked, watching them, her expression all too familiar. "You should have stayed in your place," Mrs. Jenkins added, louder now, for the whole street to hear. The humiliation hit Lily like a punch to the gut. It wasn't the first time she'd faced this kind of hate, but it was the first time it had been so brazen, so public. Just as Lily was about to say something, a sleek black car rolled up, its tinted windows lowering slowly. The figure behind the wheel, the man in the black suit, looked out, catching the tense scene. He locked eyes with Lily, a smile playing on his lips as he nodded. Then, without a word, he drove away. The ground beneath Lily's feet shifted. Lily Thompson gripped the door handle of her car, her knuckles turning white as the warm breeze ruffled her hair. The house was everything they had hoped for, big enough for the kids to run around in, with a yard that smelled of fresh grass. It was a new chapter, far from the cramped city apartment that had once felt like a prison. They had made it. Her daughter, Mia, bounced around excitedly on the passenger side, but Lily couldn't shake the weight in her chest. The move to Brookwood had been a dream for James, her husband, but Lily felt like she was about to walk into something she wasn't prepared for. "Mom, look," Mia shouted, pointing at a tree in the yard. "A swing." Lily smiled, trying to hold back the lump in her throat. She wanted to believe this was a fresh start they needed, but something about the quiet streets and pristine lawns made her uneasy, like there was something hidden beneath the surface. Just as they approached the front porch, a voice called out from across the street. "Well, well, well." Mrs. Jenkins sneered from her porch, her hands resting on her hips. She was an older woman with a thin, almost skeletal frame, and her eyes, sharp and cold, pierced right through Lily. "Didn't think people like you would make it here." Lily froze, her pulse quickening. She could feel the heat of Mrs. Jenkins' gaze on her, a silent accusation that said more than words ever could. James, who had been unloading boxes from the car, stiffened beside her. "Excuse me," Lily said, trying to keep her voice steady. "You heard me," Mrs. Jenkins replied, her lips curling into a smirk. "You people don't belong here." The words hung in the air like poison. Lily's heart hammered in her chest as she struggled to find the right response. But before she could say anything, a car drove past them, honking loudly. It wasn't the usual friendly greeting. No, this was deliberate. The car sped away, and Lily turned to see Mrs. Jenkins, eyes glinting with malicious satisfaction. "Should have stayed in your place," she added, louder now, her voice carrying across the street. "You learn." Lily's breath hitched in her throat. She was fighting to stay calm, but the anger was bubbling up, threatening to spill over. Mia tugged at her sleeve, her face scrunched in confusion. "Mom, why is she so mean?" she asked, her voice small. Lily swallowed hard, her chest tight. Before she could answer, a black car pulled up to the curb. The window rolled down slowly, and Lily's eyes locked with the driver, a man in a dark suit, his expression unreadable. For a moment, he just stared at her, and then with a slight nod, he rolled the window back up and drove away. Lily's stomach twisted. Something wasn't right. She could feel it in the pit of her stomach. This wasn't just about one neighbor, one encounter. This was bigger. She didn't know it yet, but that moment would be the one that set everything in motion. Lily sat at the kitchen table later that evening, her hands wrapped tightly around a mug of tea, its steam rising in slow, spiraling tendrils. She had tried to shake off the encounter with Mrs. Jenkins, but the words still echoed in her head. "You people don't belong here." James was unpacking the last of the boxes in the living room, but he hadn't said much since they'd come inside. She could feel his silence, thick and heavy, like a cloud hanging over them. His frustration mirrored her own, but he was doing his best to remain composed. "Did you see the way she looked at us?" Lily asked, her voice quieter than she meant it to be. James didn't respond right away. Instead, he set a box on the floor with a sharp thud and looked out the window, where the evening light cast long shadows across their front lawn. The stillness outside was unsettling. The whole neighborhood felt like it was watching them. "They've got their way of doing things here," he finally said, his tone weary. "We're the new ones, and people like Mrs. Jenkins, they don't like change." Lily frowned, her mind racing. She had seen that look on Mrs. Jenkins' face, the way the woman had looked down on them, almost as if they were intruders, unwelcome, out of place. It wasn't just prejudice. It was something more insidious, like a warning. She wondered what they had stepped into, moving here. The truth was, she had always known that people like them, black, middle class, weren't the ideal resident of places like Brookwood, but she had hoped that here, in this so-called new beginning, they could escape the subtle, everyday racism that had marked their lives back in the city. Now, standing on the edge of their new life, she wondered if it would ever be different. As she sipped her tea, she let her mind wander to their neighbors. The ones they had met were polite, but distant, some with forced smiles, others too busy to really talk. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Every glance felt scrutinizing. The doorbell rang, snapping Lily out of her thoughts. She stood up quickly, expecting a neighbor to drop by, maybe to extend a welcome. But when she opened the door, it wasn't the kind of greeting she had hoped for. It was Mrs. Jenkins again. The woman stood on the doorstep, arms crossed tightly over her chest. She wasn't smiling this time. Lily's pulse quickened, but she masked her anxiety with a forced politeness. "Can I help you, Mrs. Jenkins?" Lily asked, her voice steadier than she felt. "I'm sure you'll find everything you need in this neighborhood," Mrs. Jenkins said with a tight smile, her words clipped. "But just so you know, this isn't the kind of place for people who don't fit in." Lily's heart sank. The woman's message was clear. "I didn't realize we needed to fit in," Lily replied, her voice cool, but the anger building inside her was hard to ignore. Mrs. Jenkins' eyes flickered with something close to amusement. "Oh, you'll find out soon enough." She took a step back, turning toward the street. "I just thought you should know," she added, before walking away without another word. Lily closed the door behind her, her breath shaky. This wasn't just about one neighbor's opinion. It was about something bigger, a social structure designed to keep them out, keep them apart. "Who was it?" James asked from the kitchen, his voice tense. Lily's mind raced, but she kept her voice calm. "Just Mrs. Jenkins. She's making sure we understand the rules here." James didn't say anything for a moment, and Lily couldn't tell if he was angry or resigned. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost himself. "It's not just her. It's everyone in this neighborhood. It's how they've always done things. But maybe it's time we stop pretending we don't belong." Lily nodded, her heart heavy with the weight of what was to come. She knew they couldn't let this go. This was just the beginning. Something had to change. But what could they do? Chapter 3, A Silent Betrayal. The next morning, Lily woke up with a sense of foreboding in her chest. It was a familiar feeling now, as if a storm was looming on the horizon, but they were too caught in the calm to see it. She glanced out the window and saw Mrs. Jenkins again, standing on her porch, her gaze sweeping over their house like she was marking it. Lily couldn't shake the image of the woman's eyes, cold and judgmental. The neighborhood had felt so welcoming when they first visited. They had been shown manicured lawns, picture-perfect homes, and polite smiles. But now, after only a few days of settling in, everything felt different. They were outsiders. And worse, Lily had the distinct sense that they were being watched, monitored even. James didn't talk much about it, but she could tell it was bothering him too. He worked long hours as a contractor, and his attempt to settle into their new life felt half-hearted, as if the weight of the neighborhood's expectations was already pushing down on him. That evening, Mrs. Jenkins' invitation arrived. It was a formal affair, a neighborhood barbecue to welcome the new neighbors. The kind of event that was supposed to be warm and inviting, But Lily could already sense it wasn't. She didn't want to go, but James insisted they should at least make an effort to fit in. "It's the right thing to do," he said, though his tone lacked the conviction he normally carried. When they arrived at the barbecue, it was a picture of suburban perfection. Families chatting, kids running around the yard, all under the warm glow of string lights. But as soon as they stepped into the garden, the smiles faded. A few of the neighbors looked over, quickly turning away, pretending they hadn't noticed them. Some murmured to each other behind their hands. And Mrs. Jenkins, who had invited them, barely acknowledged their presence. "Don't mind them," one of the men said, his smile strained. He was a tall, well-dressed man who introduced himself as Paul. "This is just how it is around here. People don't like change." Lily nodded, but the words stung. She wanted to say something, wanted to call out the subtle racism that was tainting the air, but instead, she forced a smile. It felt like a game of pretending, of playing along so they wouldn't be ostracized. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't ignore the cold shoulder from everyone around them. Later, as she wandered through the crowd, Lily overheard a conversation between two women near the grill. They were talking in hushed tones, but their words carried. "She doesn't fit here. I don't care what anyone says," one woman said, her voice thick with disdain. "That family? They're bringing the neighborhood down." The other woman laughed softly. "It's not just them. It's all the people they're bringing in. I heard they're pushing for more development around here. They want to ruin the charm of this place. They should have stayed where they belong." Lily froze, her heart dropping to her stomach. The whispers were loud enough for her to hear, and the words cut deeper than she could have anticipated. This wasn't just about Mrs. Jenkins. It was about a whole community, a whole system that saw them as nothing more than invaders. She turned away, her chest tightening, and found James standing by the food table. Without a word, he took her hand, squeezing it tightly. The truth was undeniable now. They had been betrayed by the very people who had welcomed them. But Lily couldn't ignore the surge of anger in her gut, the feeling that this wouldn't be the last time she'd face this kind of treatment. Their silence had protected them for a time, but no longer. The fight was about to begin. Lily Thompson stood near the grill, half-heartedly nodding at the conversations around her. Though her mind wasn't present, the soft hum of suburban chatter swirled through the air, the smell of barbecue mingling with the night's cool breeze. She had always hated these forced gatherings, but tonight she was here because James insisted. It was the right thing to do, he'd said, his voice laced with the exhaustion of a long workday. Lily knew he was just trying to make their new life in Brookwood work, but each passing moment felt like an unwelcome reminder that they didn't belong. She tried to focus on the mundane. Kids laughing in the yard, the sound of soda cans being cracked open, but the nagging feeling in her chest wouldn't go away. It had started the minute they stepped into Mrs. Jenkins' meticulously manicured backyard, and it only grew as the evening wore on. Every glance felt like an assessment, a measurement of her family's worth, as if they were specimens under a microscope. James had already started talking to a few of the men at the beer table, nodding along to something they were saying about the best local contractors. Lily appreciated that he was trying, but she could see the tightness in his jaw, the guarded way he interacted with the others. He was keeping up appearances, something he'd learned to do over the years, but she could tell it wasn't easy for him, the same way it wasn't easy for her. Lily was about to turn back to find him when she overheard a conversation behind her. Two women, standing just beyond the flower beds, were talking in low voices. Lily could only make out bits and pieces, but what she caught stopped her cold. "You know," one of the women said, her voice dripping with disdain, "I heard she's trying to organize a group to revitalize the area. She's been meeting with people about all these new housing projects, all these urban developments coming in, trying to bring all sorts of people here." Lily's heart skipped. Urban developments? New housing projects? Her thoughts raced. She turned ever so slightly, trying to remain inconspicuous as she listened. The second woman, clearly in agreement, added, "I heard she's got her eye on some of these properties, trying to get control of the land. We'll be the ones stuck with the consequences, if that happens. The whole charm of this place will be gone." Lily's fingers tightened around her cup, and her pulse quickened. They were talking about her family. She'd heard rumors like this before, about people like them moving into neighborhoods and disrupting the status quo. But hearing it so plainly, so openly, felt like a punch to the gut. Maybe she doesn't realize, the first woman continued, but this isn't the place for her kind. I'm all for diversity, but there are limits. If we're not careful, it'll be all over. Lily's stomach churned. Her kind. The words echoed in her mind, chilling her more than the cool evening air ever could. She had heard those words before, from classmates in high school, from people who looked at her like she didn't belong. But now, here it was again, playing out in the very neighborhood she'd hoped would be their fresh start. She looked around, her gaze searching for James. He was deep in conversation with some of the other men, his back turned, unaware of the quiet storm brewing around her. Lily felt the weight of the words settle deep in her chest. There was no pretending anymore. This wasn't just Mrs. Jenkins. It wasn't just one neighbor with a problem. This was systemic. It was how they were viewed, how they would always be viewed, no matter how well they fit in or how hard they tried. She didn't know if it was the heat of the moment or if it was a mixture of anger and humiliation, but she needed to get out of there. The party, the forced smiles, the fake conversations. It was all too much. Lily took a step back, moving toward the edge of the yard, away from the group of neighbors who continued to chatter about nothing of consequence. Her chest tightened as she turned toward the corner of the yard. Her mind screamed for her to say something. Anything, but what good would it do? What good would it do to fight when the whole system was stacked against them? Just as she was about to step off the patio and walk toward the side gate, she heard a familiar voice. Lily. She turned quickly, startled. James stood at the edge of the crowd, his face shadowed with concern. His eyes searched hers, and there was something in his gaze that made her heart ache. "You okay?" he asked, his voice low and quiet, the noise of the party suddenly receding into the background. Lily opened her mouth to speak, but nothing came out. How could she explain this? How could she put into words what she was feeling? The crushing weight of being the outsider, the invader in a neighborhood that had always belonged to someone else. The judgment that hung in the air, thick and suffocating. "Lily," James repeated, stepping closer. For a moment, she didn't answer. She simply stood there, taking the sight of him, his tired eyes, his stiff posture, the way his hand seemed to hover at his side, unsure whether to reach out. He wasn't the kind of man to show his vulnerabilities, but she could see it in him, too. The silent frustration, the slow burn of being trapped in a place that wasn't ready for them. The way it felt like everything they had worked for was slipping away, piece by piece. "I heard them," she said finally, her voice breaking the silence. "The women behind the flowers. They're talking about us, about what we're doing here." James' expression darkened, and for the first time that evening, he looked genuinely angry. "What did they say?" Lily bit her lip, refusing to let herself break down. "They're scared, James. Scared that we'll ruin their perfect little neighborhood. They're scared of what we represent. They don't want us here." James clenched his fists at his sides, a vein pulsing in his neck. "We knew it wasn't going to be easy," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "But this is something else." Lily's throat tightened. She didn't want to cry, but the tears were there, just behind her eyes, ready to spill. She had been so sure when they moved here that it would be different, that maybe they could find a place where they didn't have to fight every day to prove they belonged. But standing here on this porch, surrounded by the polite hostility of their neighbors, she realized something. Nothing would ever change unless they fought for it. They weren't just fighting to fit in anymore. They were fighting for the right to exist, to live here without fear, without judgment. "I can't do this anymore, James," she whispered. "I can't keep pretending everything's okay when it's not." He reached for her hand then, his grip firm, grounding her in the moment. "We won't pretend anymore, Lily. We won't." For the first time that evening, Lily felt a spark of hope. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep her going. It was time to stop being silent. Time to start fighting back. The sun had barely dipped below the horizon when Lily and James sat together on the couch, the weight of the evening still heavy between them. The house was silent, except for the soft hum of the refrigerator and the distant sounds of children playing in the neighborhood. The TV was on, but neither of them was paying attention. They were too far gone in their thoughts, replaying the moments from the barbecue, each word, each glance, each slight. James had been quieter than usual since they got home. Lily could sense the tension building in him, his usual calm demeanor now strained. She had never seen him so angry, yet he hadn't said much about the encounter. He had simply gone about unpacking, lost in the physical motions of putting things in order. But she knew him well enough to see the internal war raging within him. He was fighting with the same demons she was. "I don't get it," James said suddenly, his voice rough with frustration. "I thought this was the place where we could build something better, where we could leave all that mess behind us." Lily nodded, though she had the same question. What had they gotten themselves into? Brookwood wasn't supposed to be like this. It was supposed to be a place of opportunity, a fresh start. But it seemed the deeper they dug, the more they realized how deeply rooted the prejudices were. "The more we try to be part of this community," Lily said quietly, her fingers tracing the edge of the coffee table, "the more we're reminded that we don't fit in." James looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger and confusion. "This is more than that, though. I can feel it. It's not just about us being outsiders. It's something worse. These people, they're all tied together somehow. Mrs. Jenkins, the others, they've got some kind of hold over this place." Lily sat back, thinking over his words. He was right. Mrs. Jenkins wasn't just a neighbor with an opinion. She was something more, someone with power. The way she had controlled the conversation at the barbecue, the way she moved through the crowd like she was the gatekeeper of the neighborhood. It wasn't just about personal prejudice. There was something deeper at play here, something systemic. Lily's mind started to piece it together. They had only been here for a few days, but the more she thought about it, the more she saw the patterns. Brookwood wasn't just an affluent community. It was an exclusive one, and that exclusivity wasn't just based on money. It was about power, control, and keeping things the way they had always been. Mrs. Jenkins, with her tight grip on the neighborhood social fabric, wasn't an outlier. She was a symptom of something much larger. "It's not just her," Lily said slowly, almost to herself. "It's everyone. They've all been conditioned. They've been here for so long. They think this place belongs to them and no one else." James was quiet, but the flicker of realization crossed his face. He understood what she was saying. Brookwood wasn't just a neighborhood. It was a fortress built on exclusion. And they were the enemy. "Maybe we're the ones who've been blind," he said softly, leaning back in his chair. "Maybe we thought this would be different. But it's not. They don't want us here. And we're not just fighting one person. We're fighting a whole system." Lily sat up straighter, her heart pounding with a renewed sense of urgency. What if we're not just fighting the people who are outright hostile? What if the ones who seem nice, who are pretending to be friends, are just as complicit? They're all part of it. They just don't realize it yet. James shook his head. Or maybe they do realize it. They just don't care. Lily's mind raced. She thought about the subtle dismissals they had experienced over the past few days, offhand comments from neighbors, the way people averted their eyes when they walked past them, the strange silences that followed whenever they joined a conversation. It wasn't just overt racism. It was a quiet kind, the kind that made you feel like you didn't belong before you even opened your mouth. And then there was Mrs. Jenkins. It wasn't just that she had made them feel unwelcome. It was the way she held sway over the neighborhood. Lily had heard her name whispered with reverence by some of the other neighbors at the barbecue. They spoke of her as if she were the ruler of this small, suburban kingdom, someone who decided who stayed and who left. The more Lily thought about it, the more she realized Mrs. Jenkins had far more influence than she had first assumed. "She's not just a gossip, is she?" Lily asked, her voice low. James frowned. "No, she's more than that. I think she controls things behind the scenes. She probably has a hand in the neighborhood's real estate dealings." Lily's stomach twisted. It was starting to make sense. Mrs. Jenkins wasn't just one person throwing her weight around. She had connections. She had resources. And she wasn't just trying to intimidate them. She was trying to push them out. But why? Is it the house? Lily asked, her voice rising with the realization. Is it because we bought this property? James's eyes narrowed. I think it is. I think we've walked into something bigger than we thought. Maybe Mrs. Jenkins owns more than just her house. Maybe she owns a lot more than that. The more they spoke, the more the pieces clicked into place. Lily had noticed how Mrs. Jenkins had treated them differently compared to the other newcomers. She had singled them out, made her judgment clear, but there was something more. Mrs. Jenkins wasn't just reacting to their race. She was reacting to their ownership, to the fact that Lily and James had staked a claim in a neighborhood that, in her mind, wasn't for people like them. Lily stood up, pacing. If she's controlling the real estate, she's controlling the whole neighborhood. No one moves in or out without her say-so. That's how she's been keeping this place pure. James clenched his jaw. And we just stepped into her territory. Without realizing it, we become part of her problem. Lily stopped in her tracks, a spark of realization lighting her eyes. Then we have to take control back. We can't let her decide who belongs here. We have to expose this. She's using the system to control everyone around her. James looked at her, his expression serious. We can't do this alone. Lily nodded. She knew that. They couldn't fight something this deeply entrenched on their own. They needed allies, other people who had been crushed by the weight of the same system, who had been too afraid to speak up, too afraid to challenge the power that Mrs. Jenkins had cultivated for years. We need to find the cracks, Lily said, her voice steady now. We need to figure out who else is involved, who else is letting this happen. And then we have to expose it. All of it. James stood up, walking over to her. He put his hand on her shoulder, his grip firm, and looked her in the eyes. We'll do it together. But we need to be smart about this. Lily met his gaze, feeling a surge of determination. It's time to make them see. This is our neighborhood, too. And just like that, they knew the fight wasn't over. It was only just beginning. The following days felt like a fog to Lily. Every time she stepped outside, the oppressive weight of Brookwood bore down on her. It wasn't just the unspoken glances or the forced smiles. It was a sense that every step she took was under a microscope. She had spent years trying to build a life for herself and her family, and now it felt like everything was slowly slipping away because they didn't fit into the mold that had been created for this community. James was the same, more withdrawn than ever, his mind clearly consumed with the idea that something had to be done. They had already decided. They couldn't just remain silent, couldn't just accept what was happening around them. But where would they even begin? Who could they trust? That's when Eric Johnson appeared. It happened on a Thursday afternoon. Lily had been on her way to the grocery store when a sleek, black car pulled up beside her. The tinted windows slowly rolled down, revealing a man in a sharp, dark suit. He had the look of someone who belonged in the corridors of power, someone who carried weight, though Lily had never seen him before. The car's engine idled, purring softly in the quiet street. She hesitated, eyeing him cautiously. But there was something about the way he looked at her, an understanding, an unspoken connection, that made her pause. "You're Lily Thompson, right?" he asked, his voice smooth and measured. Lily didn't respond immediately, uncertainty rising in her chest. She was used to people recognizing her, but there was something off about this encounter. "Yes, I am," she said, her voice tight with suspicion. He nodded, as if he had been expecting her to confirm it. "I've been following the situation here. What's been happening to you and your family? It's not right." Lily's heart skipped a beat. Was this some sort of trick? A setup? But the man's calm demeanor, the way he spoke, almost as if he knew her inner turmoil, made her hesitate. "I don't know what you mean," she replied, though the words fell hollow. She had already seen enough to know exactly what he was referring to. The systematic exclusion, the quiet animosity, the way they were being subtly pushed to the margins. "I think you do," he said, his voice lowering. "I've seen what Mrs. Jenkins is doing, and I'm not the only one. She's been running this neighborhood like a kingdom for years, controlling who can and can't move in. She's pulling strings behind the scenes, keeping people like you out. But the truth is, you're not the only one she's been targeting. Lily froze. Her blood ran cold. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice shaking with a mix of fear and anger. Eric leaned forward slightly, his gaze intense but not threatening. "I'm with a group of people who've been quietly trying to expose what's going on here. What Mrs. Jenkins is doing isn't just about race, though that's part of it. It's about control. It's about money. It's about keeping the property values high by keeping certain people out and making sure no one ever questions the system she's built. The whole neighborhood is in her grip." Lily's mind raced, trying to process his words. She had known instinctively that Mrs. Jenkins wasn't just a racist old woman with a chip on her shoulder. But this was a whole new level of manipulation. Mrs. Jenkins wasn't just spitting venom. She was systematically manipulating the housing market, making sure only people who fit a certain profile could afford to move in. She was controlling the entire flow of who came and went in Brookwood. "And you want to help us?" Lily asked, the skepticism dripping from her voice. She had grown accustomed to people offering help for their own gain, especially people like Mrs. Jenkins. Eric smiled faintly, almost as if he had anticipated her question. "I don't want to help you. I want to help everyone she's been hurting. The truth is, you and your family are just a part of a much bigger picture. And I'm guessing you're already starting to realize that." Lily swallowed hard. "How do you know all of this?" Eric sat back, his fingers resting lightly on the steering wheel as he regarded her. "I've been following her for years. It started with small things, requests for approvals from the city that never went through, sudden restrictions on property sales, those ridiculous community meetings where everyone had to pretend everything was perfect. It all seemed innocent enough until I started digging deeper. That's when I found out how far-reaching her influence really is. It's not just a local issue. It's a larger conspiracy that connects back to the real estate development companies that are buying up properties in this area." Lily felt a chill crawl up her spine. "And you think you can stop her?" "I don't know if we can stop her completely," Eric admitted. "But I do know one thing. She's not invincible. She's made a lot of enemies along the way. People who want the truth to come out. People who want to see the system dismantled." Lily's mind was spinning. This was everything she had been afraid of, everything she had felt but hadn't been able to articulate. Mrs. Jenkins was the face of it, but the whole system was built on greed, control, and racism. It wasn't just about her family. This was about a community being held hostage by a few powerful individuals who thought they could decide who belonged and who didn't. Eric's voice broke through her thoughts. "I'm not asking for your trust right away, but I am asking you to listen. I know you felt it. The pressure, the silent stares, the way everything seemed stacked against you. But the truth is you've got something Mrs. Jenkins doesn't. You've got the property. Your family owns a significant portion of this neighborhood, whether you realize it or not." Lily blinked, the words slowly sinking in. "What do you mean? We don't own this neighborhood." "You do," Eric said. "Your family owns more land here than you think, and that gives you power, not just in terms of money, but in terms of influence. You got a seat at the table now, whether you know it or not. And that's why Mrs. Jenkins is so threatened by you." Lily felt her pulse quicken. The weight of his words hit her, like a ton of bricks. They were sitting on power, she realized. They were sitting on something far more significant than they had ever imagined. "How do we use it?" she asked, the question slipping out before she could think about it. She didn't want to get ahead of herself, but the thought of turning the tables on Mrs. Jenkins filled her with a flicker of hope. Eric smiled again, this time with genuine warmth. "That's the question, isn't it? And that's why we need to work together. But we need to be careful. People like Mrs. Jenkins don't give up their power easily." Lily looked at him, her heart pounding. She had no idea what she was about to get into, but she knew one thing. This was bigger than she ever thought. The stakes were higher now. "I'm in," she said firmly. "We're in. What's the next step?" Eric nodded, his eyes gleaming with approval. "Good. We start by taking back what's rightfully yours." And just like that, Lily realized the game was about to change. The days following Eric's visit passed in a blur. Lily and James spent their time piecing together the fractured truths about their neighborhood and their newfound power. Every conversation with Eric left her more convinced that the battle they were about to enter was far bigger than anything they had imagined. The realization that their family owned a significant portion of Brookwood had taken root in her mind, but she still couldn't quite fathom the weight of it. Every time she tried to grasp the concept, it felt like trying to hold water in her hands. But what Eric had told them was clear. Mrs. Jenkins wasn't just a racist woman with too much time on her hands. She was the gatekeeper to an entire system of control, an empire built on the backs of people who were denied access to the same opportunities. And now, with the knowledge that their family had a stake in Brookwood's future, the Thompsons were standing at a crossroads. They could do nothing, play it safe, and continue to accept the hostile whispers, the subtle slights, and the exclusion. Or they could use the leverage they had, the land they owned, and fight back, expose the truth for what it was, even if it meant burning down everything they had worked for. "We need to find the cracks," Eric had said when they first met. And now, after days of research and cautious conversations, Lily could see those cracks in the system widening. One afternoon, as Lily and James sat at the kitchen table, mapping out their next steps, a message from Eric arrived. It was simple yet powerful. "The moment is coming. We need to act before they silence us." Lily stared at the screen, her thoughts spinning. James, who had been quieter than usual, met her gaze across the table. She could see the uncertainty in his eyes, but also a growing resolve. Neither of them had been prepared for this fight, but now they had no choice. It was time to confront the hidden power structure that had kept them at bay for so long. "We have to make sure we're not just reacting," Lily said, her voice steady. "We need to be strategic. If we're going to take back control of this neighborhood, we need to expose what Mrs. Jenkins has been doing. We need to show people that this isn't just a few bad neighbors. It's a system." James nodded. "But how do we get people on our side? Mrs. Jenkins has been here for years. She's got influence." Lily leaned back in her chair, considering his words. She'd spent the last few nights researching the names and histories of the people in the neighborhood, digging into property records, and even talking to a few longtime residents who had also seemed uneasy with the way things were. Slowly, a pattern emerged. Mrs. Jenkins had control over most of the real estate transactions in Brookwood, not just through her influence over the local council or through quiet deals behind closed doors, but through a web of connections that extended into the real estate developers themselves. "I think we start with the truth," Lily said finally, her voice firm. "We start with the property records. We show people what's really been happening here. But we also need to bring in the people who've been left out of the system, the ones who were pushed out, the ones who want to buy homes here, but were turned away. We need them to speak up." James looked thoughtful. "We need allies, people who aren't just going to back down when Mrs. Jenkins comes after them." Lily had already thought about that. She had seen a few familiar faces at the barbecue, some of the people who had seemed uncomfortable with Mrs. Jenkins' behavior, the ones who had given brief, apologetic smiles but hadn't had the courage to speak out. Lily knew they were the key. She would go to them first. If they could get a few people to stand with them, it could make all the difference. The next day, Lily made her first move. She visited Clara, an older woman who had lived in Brookwood for over 20 years. Clara had lived 2 houses down from Mrs. Jenkins, and though they had never been close, Lily had noticed that Clara always looked uncomfortable when Mrs. Jenkins was around. The woman had never openly criticized her neighbor, but her quiet sighs and hesitant gestures spoke volumes. When Lily arrived at Clara's home, the older woman greeted her with a polite but reserved smile, inviting her in. They sat together at the kitchen table, sipping tea as Lily carefully approached the subject. "You've been here a long time, Clara," Lily began gently. "You must know how the neighborhood has changed over the years." Clara nodded slowly, her eyes flickering toward the window, where Mrs. Jenkins' house was visible. "I've seen a lot of people come and go, dear. Not everyone stays, not everyone fits in. This place, it's changed. People like you, well, they're rare here. You have to work hard to make it work." Lily hesitated for a moment, her heart pounding in her chest. "Clara, I'm not sure if you know this, but Mrs. Jenkins, she's been controlling who gets to move in and out of this neighborhood. She's been shutting people out, making deals with developers, driving property prices up while excluding certain families. I've seen the records. I know what's been going on." Clara's face softened with a mixture of sadness and resignation. She didn't seem shocked, just tired. I've heard whispers, but no one says anything. No one wants to rock the boat. Mrs. Jenkins, she's been here for so long, and people are scared of her. She's got power, Lily. More power than anyone realizes. Lily leaned forward, her voice low, but filled with conviction. We have power too, Clara. More than we know. Our family owns a big chunk of this neighborhood, and I think it's time we use that to expose the truth. People need to know what's been happening, but we can't do it alone. We need people who are willing to stand up, who aren't afraid of what she'll do. Clara was silent for a long moment, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. You're right. Someone has to do something. It might as well be you. Lily's heart skipped. She had done it. She had found her first ally. Thank you, she whispered, gratitude swelling in her chest. Clara's eyes met hers, a new fire kindling in her gaze. But you better be ready. She's not going to give up that easily. Mrs. Jenkins plays dirty. Lily nodded. We'll be ready. By the time Lily left Clara's house, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. Clara wasn't the only one who had been kept in the dark or silenced by fear. There were others, too. People who had witnessed the same injustices, who had stayed silent for far too long. It was time to break that silence, to bring Brookwood's darkest secrets into the light. She didn't know exactly how this would play out, but she knew one thing for sure. The power was shifting. It was no longer Mrs. Jenkins who held the reins. It was them, the Thompsons, Clara, and everyone else who had been pushed aside by the system. Together, they would take back what was rightfully theirs. And nothing, not even Mrs. Jenkins' influence, would stop them. The plan had been set into motion, and there was no turning back now. The sense of urgency that plagued Lily for days had grown into something more, a fire that burned deep within her. The truth was finally coming to light, and the more she uncovered, the more the system she and her family had unknowingly entered began to reveal itself for what it truly was, a fortress built on lies and exclusion. It was time for it to come crashing down. Lily sat in the dim light of their living room, papers scattered in front of her, the property records, the names of developers, the list of neighbors who had been manipulated or quietly pushed out. All of it was now connected. With the help of Clara and a few others who quietly joined their cause, they had pieced together the puzzle. They had built a case, not just against Mrs. Jenkins, but against the entire system that had kept people like them from gaining a foothold in Brookwood. James stood by the window, his gaze fixed on the street outside, but Lily could tell his mind was elsewhere. There was a tension in his posture, a barely contained frustration. This wasn't just about the house anymore. This was about something bigger, something that could affect everything they had worked for. You sure about this? He asked, his voice low, his back still to her. This could get ugly. Mrs. Jenkins has friends in high places. You're not just exposing her. You're exposing the whole system. Lily didn't have to think about her answer. She had known, from the moment Eric had first approached her, that this wasn't going to be easy. It wasn't just a battle for property or respect. It was a battle against an entire community's way of thinking. But the more she thought about it, the more she knew they had to fight. It wasn't just about them anymore. It was about everyone who had been silenced, who had been pushed to the edges of a neighborhood they had every right to be part of. We don't have a choice, James, she said, her voice firm. People need to know the truth. If we don't act now, nothing will ever change. And I'm not going to let our family be a footnote in someone else's story. James turned around, his eyes intense. He walked over to her, sitting down beside her at the table, his hand resting on hers. The weight of the moment settled between them, but Lily felt his support, strong, unwavering. He was with her, and together they would face whatever came next. I know, he said softly. I know. I've seen how hard people will fight to protect what they've got. We have to be careful. Lily nodded, understanding his fears. Mrs. Jenkins had already shown how ruthless she could be, and now, with the power of the neighborhood's secrets in their hands, Lily knew they had to be prepared for the fallout. But there was no turning back. The truth had come out. Their first step was to organize a town hall meeting. They had carefully chosen the right timing, knowing that Mrs. Jenkins would never expect them to act so openly. The goal was simple: draw attention to the injustices taking place in Brookwood, expose Mrs. Jenkins' role in the manipulation of property sales, and start a conversation that couldn't be ignored. Lily had reached out to a few trusted neighbors who, like Clara, had quietly resisted Mrs. Jenkins' control. Together, they had set the date and began spreading the word. It was a risk, gathering people who had lived under Mrs. Jenkins' thumb for years, but it was the only way to shift the balance of power. On the evening of the meeting, the air was thick with anticipation. The local community center was buzzing with nervous energy. Lily had never seen so many familiar faces in one room, and for the first time, she felt a sense of solidarity. Neighbors who had once exchanged only polite pleasantries were now gathered for a common cause. But the fear in their eyes was palpable. This wasn't just about taking a stand. It was about confronting years of injustice, years of silence. As the meeting began, Lily took her seat at the front, her heart racing. She had prepared her speech, but in the pit of her stomach, she knew it wasn't the words that would matter. It was the truth they would speak together, the undeniable weight of their collective voices. That would make all the difference. The room settled into a quiet murmur as the first speaker, a middle-aged man named Robert, stood up. He cleared his throat, his hands trembling slightly as he adjusted the microphone. He had lived in Brookwood for over a decade, but like many others, he had never dared to speak against the status quo. "Thank you for letting me speak," Robert said, his voice unsteady but determined. "I've lived here for a long time, and I've seen things that shouldn't happen in a community like this. Mrs. Jenkins, she's controlled this neighborhood for years. But she doesn't just control who lives here. She controls who gets to stay, who gets to have a future. My neighbor, a good man, tried to buy a house here last year. He had the money, he had the approval, but somehow the house was taken off the market. No one ever explained why. And when he asked, the answer was always the same: not available. I know I'm not the only one who's had something like this happen." There was a murmur of agreement around the room, and Lily's heart swelled with hope. They were listening. They were ready. Lily stood up next, her voice steady as she addressed the crowd. She explained how her family's research had uncovered the truth. Mrs. Jenkins had been using her position of influence to manipulate property values, systematically excluding certain families from Brookwood under the guise of community exclusivity. She presented the property records, the names of developers who had been involved in questionable transactions, and the evidence that they had compiled over the last few weeks. The room was silent for a moment. Then, a voice called out from the back. "I knew it," an older woman said, her voice trembling with rage. "I knew something wasn't right, but I was too afraid to say anything." Another voice joined in. "We've all seen it. We just didn't have the courage to fight back." Lily's breath caught in her throat as the crowd began to murmur in agreement. The room was coming alive with voices that had been silent for far too long. It was happening. They were speaking up. And in that moment, Lily knew that the silence they had lived under for so long was finally being broken. But the real test came when Mrs. Jenkins walked in. The room went silent as she entered, her sharp eyes scanning the crowd. She was flanked by two other well-dressed individuals, her allies, no doubt. Lily felt a chill run down her spine as Mrs. Jenkins' gaze locked with hers. There was no fear in the woman's eyes, just contempt and perhaps a hint of amusement. "So this is how you repay me?" Mrs. Jenkins' voice was like ice. "This is what you want? To tear apart the community I've spent years building." Lily stood tall, her voice clear and strong. "You didn't build this community, Mrs. Jenkins. You controlled it, and it's time for that to end." The tension in the room was palpable. This was it, the moment they had all been waiting for. Mrs. Jenkins was no longer the untouchable ruler of Brookwood. She was just a woman, exposed, her power unraveling before the eyes of those she had tried so hard to silence. The room waited, breathless, and Lily knew in that moment that the battle had only just begun. The day after the town hall meeting felt like waking up from a long, suffocating dream. The events of the previous night had shifted something fundamental in the air, but the weight of what had transpired still hung heavy. There was no going back. What had begun as a quiet rebellion had now grown into a full-fledged movement, one that threatened to shatter the power that Mrs. Jenkins and others like her had built over years of unchecked control. Lily sat at the kitchen table, her fingers wrapped around a steaming mug of coffee, staring at the morning sunlight streaming through the window. It was quiet, almost unnervingly so. The streets outside were still and empty, as though the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for the next step. The meeting had gone exactly as she had hoped and feared. Mrs. Jenkins had walked into the room, full of her usual arrogance, but the tables had turned the moment the truth had spilled out. She had tried to discredit Lily's research, to paint her and her supporters as troublemakers, but the evidence had been undeniable. The property records, the testimonies, the faces of the neighbors who had stood up, trembling but resolute. It had been too much for Mrs. Jenkins to bury, even with all her influence. But the fight wasn't over. Far from it. Mrs. Jenkins had made it clear she would not go down without a fight. Her last words at the meeting echoed in Lily's mind. "You think you've won, but you've only just begun to see what I can do. This isn't over." It had been a threat, and one that carried the weight of everything Mrs. Jenkins had built. Lily glanced over at James, who was sitting on the couch, his eyes glued to his phone. His brow was furrowed, his fingers moving quickly across the screen. He looked up for a moment, meeting her gaze. "They're already retaliating," he said quietly, his voice tight with frustration. "A few of the developers on Mrs. Jenkins' side are trying to block any legal action. The city council's already talking about reviewing the situation, which means stalling." Lily's stomach twisted. She had expected pushback. She knew it was coming. Mrs. Jenkins had too many connections, too much power behind her, but that didn't make it any easier to hear. The system they had tried to fight against was already beginning to reassemble itself, patching up the cracks they had exposed. It wasn't just about taking down Mrs. Jenkins. It was about taking down the entire structure that had allowed her to hold so much power in the first place. "What can we do?" Lily asked, her voice a little more desperate than she meant it to be. James put the phone down and turned to face her fully. "We keep going. We keep fighting. We can't let them win. We have the truth on our side, Lily. That's more than they can say." The resolve in his voice was like a steady anchor, pulling her back from the edge of doubt. He was right. They couldn't stop now. But it was hard not to feel the weight of the fight pressing down on them, the fear that they were up against something much larger than they had realized. Lily's thoughts drifted to the people who had stood by her the night before. Clara, Robert, and the others. They had taken a huge risk in speaking out, and they were already beginning to feel the heat. Several of them had already reported receiving subtle threats, phone calls warning them to stay silent or face consequences. It wasn't just Mrs. Jenkins anymore. It was the entire network she had cultivated, a machine built on power and fear. The phone rang, breaking through her thoughts. She picked it up quickly, her heart skipping when she saw the caller ID. It was Clara. "Lily." Clara's voice came through the line, thick with worry. "They're coming for us." I don't know how, but I think Mrs. Jenkins has already started making calls. My son got a letter from the bank this morning saying they're reviewing the terms of our mortgage. I don't know what that means, but it doesn't sound good." Lily's heart sank. This was exactly what she had feared. Mrs. Jenkins wasn't just using her influence to control the neighborhood. She was using to destroy anyone who dared stand against her. "We're not backing down, Clara," Lily said firmly, her voice laced with determination. "This is just the beginning. You're not alone in this." "I know," Clara replied, her voice shaky but steady. "But I can feel the walls closing in. We have to be careful. If they go after the bank, what's next? Our homes? Our livelihoods?" Lily clenched her jaw, fighting the rising panic. She had expected resistance, but the scale of the retaliation was starting to overwhelm her. It wasn't just legal or political anymore. It was personal. Mrs. Jenkins wasn't just fighting for control of Brookwood. She was fighting for her own survival, and she would use any means necessary to protect herself. "We keep pushing, Clara," Lily said. "This isn't over. We'll expose what she's doing, no matter what. We got allies now. More than you know. This is bigger than her." She's just one part of the system that's been built to keep people like us out. Clara was silent for a moment, and when she spoke again, her voice was quieter but more resolute. I'm with you. We all are. After hanging up, Lily turned to James, her mind racing. We need to organize the next step. We need more people involved. More evidence. It's time we go after the institutions she's been using to hide all of this. James nodded. I agree. It's time to go public with everything. If we get the right people behind us, we can bring down the whole system. Lily stood up, pacing the room. There was no time to waste. They needed to expose the whole truth. The financial records, the political ties, the shadow deals. Every last piece of Mrs. Jenkins' network had to be laid bare. It wasn't just about Brookwood anymore. It was about every neighborhood like it, every community that had been quietly manipulated and kept under control of a few powerful individuals. We go after the city council, Lily said, more to herself than to James. We push harder on the developers. We expose the collusion between them and Mrs. Jenkins, and we get the media involved. They can't hide forever. James looked at her, a small but knowing smile forming on his lips. You're ready for this. I have to be, Lily replied, her voice steady and determined. We've already risked too much to back down now. The room was silent for a moment, the weight of their plans settling in. But as Lily looked at James, she saw the same fire in his eyes. They had already taken the first step, and there was no turning back. The battle had only just begun, but this time they were fighting from a place of power, and they wouldn't stop until the truth came to light. The sun was low in the sky when Lily stepped outside onto the porch, the late afternoon light casting long shadows across the front yard. She stood there for a moment, breathing in the crisp autumn air, trying to let the stillness of the evening settle her mind. It had been a long, exhausting journey, one that had taken more from her than she could have ever imagined, but somehow they had made it through. The fight was not over. Not yet, but the feeling of triumph, of having uncovered the truth, was beginning to sink in. Brookwood was changing, and though the battle had left scars, Lily couldn't help but feel the faint stirrings of hope as she looked out at the neighborhood. It wasn't perfect, and it might never be, but it had started to wake up, and that, she realized, was what mattered. Behind her, the sound of the front door opening made her turn. James stepped out, his face tired but content. He'd been working long hours, making calls, handling legalities, and supporting their growing movement. Despite the toll it had taken on him, he never wavered. He stood beside her now, leaning on the porch railing, his eyes following hers as they looked across the street. You did it, James said quietly, his voice a mix of pride and exhaustion. We did it. Lily smiled, but it was a bittersweet smile. We're not done yet. No, he agreed, but we've exposed everything. Mrs. Jenkins is out of the picture for good. Her network is crumbling. The developers are starting to back off. The city council's been forced to hold hearings. They can't keep pretending nothing happened. Lily let the words settle in her chest. It was true. Everything they had fought for was finally starting to come to fruition. Mrs. Jenkins had been publicly exposed for her manipulation of property values, her racial exclusion, and her involvement in a series of shady real estate dealings. The developers who had backed her were scrambling to protect their interests, and the city council had been forced to launch an official investigation. It was a start, and it felt like a victory. But there was still so much work to do. But for the first time in weeks, Lily allowed herself to breathe. They had taken on a system built on years of exclusion, corruption, and fear, and they had chipped away at it. They had rallied the community, shown the truth, and started the healing process. I know it's not over, she said softly, but it feels like a new chapter. James nodded, his arm wrapping around her shoulders as he pulled her close. We're changing things, Lily. We're not just standing up for ourselves anymore. We've shown everyone what this neighborhood has been built on, and now they can't unsee it. Lily's thoughts drifted to people who had stood with them. People like Clara and Robert, neighbors who had once stayed silent out of fear. They had risked everything to speak out, to face down Mrs. Jenkins and expose the rot beneath the polished surface of their seemingly perfect community. The scars they all carried would not fade quickly. But something had shifted. It was as if the heavy silence that had loomed over them for years had been broken. The changes hadn't just been legal or political. There was a shift in the hearts and minds of the people who had lived in Brookwood for years, watching from the sidelines, too afraid to speak up. After the town hall meeting, many of them had come forward, ready to face the truth. And that made Lily believe, deep down, that this was more than just a battle for property or ownership. It was a battle for justice, for dignity, for the right to live in a space where everyone had an equal chance to thrive. "We've made history, haven't we?" Lily said, turning to James, a quiet laugh escaping her lips. "I mean, I never thought we'd end up like this. I thought I'd just be another person who got pushed to the side." James smiled softly. "You were never just anyone. You've always had more power than you realized. We all do. And now, the whole neighborhood sees it." But even as they shared this moment of quiet triumph, Lily couldn't ignore the quiet ache that still lingered. The emotional cost of the fight hadn't been small. She thought of the fear that had gripped her family every time they had spoken out, the late nights spent going over documents, the endless phone calls with their allies. She thought of the faces of her children, seeing the stress etched on her face, the confusion of wondering why things were the way they were, and the guilt she sometimes felt for having exposed them to such a fight. She thought of the neighbors who had stood by them, and the friends who had distanced themselves when the stakes had grown too high. The emotional toll was something that couldn't be easily measured or quantified, but was there, woven into every victory and every sacrifice. And Lily knew that even as they began to rebuild their community, they would all carry those wounds with them, each one of them marked by the fight for justice. "Do you think things will ever really change, James?" Lily asked, her voice quieter now. He was silent for a moment, the weight of her question heavy in the air. "I don't know," he said finally, his voice soft but resolute. "But I think the fact that we fought, that we stood up, changes everything. We may never erase everything that's happened, but we've made a statement. And that's more than most people ever get the chance to do." Lily nodded, her hand finding his. She squeezed it tightly, the weight of the moment settling on her. The journey wasn't over, and the scars would remain. But they had opened the door, and now Brookwood, and perhaps every other community like it, had a chance to heal. It wouldn't be easy, but they had taken the first step. Later that evening, after dinner, Lily sat down at her desk, the weight of the day slowly lifting as she began to sift through more legal documents. There was still work to do, making sure Mrs. Jenkins' influence remained broken, ensuring that the city council continued to hold hearings, and that the developers who had exploited Brookwood's residents were held accountable. But for now, as Lily stared out the window at the quiet neighborhood, she allowed herself a moment of peace. The battle had been long, and it had cost them more than they could have imagined. But in the end, the truth had triumphed, and a new chapter was just beginning, not just for her family, but for Brookwood itself. The morning light spilled to the curtains, casting a soft glow across the living room. Lily stood by the window, staring out at the street. It was a quiet morning, a stark contrast to the whirlwind of emotions and events that had unfolded over the last few months. She could see the neighbors, some of whom had once avoided eye contact, now walking down the street with different air, one that was no longer tainted with the quiet, unspoken divisions that had existed before. Brookwood was beginning to heal. She could hear the soft murmur of voices in the yard, and when she stepped outside, she saw Clara, Robert, and a few others gathered at the sidewalk, talking amongst themselves. A sense of calm hung in the air, but there was also a palpable sense of community, of togetherness that had once been absent. The divisions that had ruled over this neighborhood for so long were starting to crumble, and for the first time, Lily felt a deep sense of hope. James stepped up beside her, his hand gently resting on her shoulder. "It's changing, isn't it?" he asked, his voice low and filled with wonder. Lily nodded, a soft smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "It is. Slowly, but it's happening." It had been a few weeks since the final hearing, the one where Mrs. Jenkins had been officially exposed for her role in manipulating property values and systematically excluding people of color from a neighborhood. The city council had been forced to act. Several developers had backed out of the shady deals they'd been orchestrating, and the media had picked up on the story, spreading it beyond Brookwood's borders. The investigation was still ongoing, but the damage to Mrs. Jenkins' reputation had been irreparable. She had been stripped of her position in the Homeowners Association, and her influence, once so firmly entrenched, was now slipping away. But while that battle had been won, the emotional toll of the fight was not something that would disappear overnight. There were still threats, still whispers behind closed doors. Mrs. Jenkins' supporters had not all gone quietly into the night. Lily knew they had made powerful enemies, and the system that had protected people like Mrs. Jenkins for so long still had its claws in Brookwood. But for the first time, Lily believed they had a chance to truly change the future. "I keep thinking about how much we've lost along the way," Lily said quietly, her voice tinged with both sorrow and gratitude. "How much we've sacrificed to get here. It's hard not to wonder if it was all worth it." James squeezed her shoulder. "I know it's been hard, but think about it. Look at how far we've come. Not just for us, but for everyone who was too afraid to speak out. We've given them a voice, and we've given Brookwood a chance to be something better." Lily's eyes wandered across the yard again, settling on a group of neighbors who had once been silent, who had once feared the repercussions of standing up to Mrs. Jenkins. They were no longer just bystanders. They were part of something bigger, part of a movement that had begun with a single voice, but had grown into something powerful. The silence between her and James wasn't uncomfortable. It was filled with shared understanding. They had both known this would never be easy, but seeing the faces of their neighbors, seeing the shifts in community, made all the hard work, all the pain, worth it. Lily had changed, too. She had come to Brookwood with the dream of finding a peaceful life for her family, a place where they could put down roots without fear. But now, she understood that peace didn't come without effort. It was something you had to fight for. And sometimes, fighting meant more than just protecting your own. It meant standing up for the people who had no voice, for those who had been marginalized for far too long. It had been the quiet resistance of people like Clara, Robert, and others that had kept the spark of hope alive. They had all felt it, that gnawing fear that change was impossible. But they had come together, united in their belief that things could be different. Now, the community felt different, stronger, more connected, and more aware of the need to protect each other. "We're not done yet," Lily said softly, her gaze still lingering on the neighbors. "We've made progress, but there's still so much work to do. We need to make sure that the changes we fought for are lasting ones." James nodded. "I agree, but we've laid the groundwork. We've shown people that it's possible to change things. That's the first step." The next step, Lily knew, would be just as challenging as the first. The fight against systemic injustice wasn't over. It never would be. But they had shown that it was possible to dismantle the structures that kept people oppressed, and they had started the conversation that needed to happen. The meeting at the community center had marked a turning point for many in Brookwood. It had been the moment when everyone could no longer deny the truth of the exclusion, the manipulation, and the silent complicity that had allowed people like Mrs. Jenkins to thrive while others suffered. It had been a hard truth to face, but in the end, it had been the catalyst of the change that was beginning to unfold. As the days turned into weeks, more people had come forward, ready to join the cause. Local organizations had offered support, and the press had kept the story alive, forcing the city council to continue their investigations and hold more hearings on the corrupt practices that had been allowed to fester in the city for so long. And as the changes continued, Lily began to see a transformation in herself. She had started this fight with the hope of securing a better future for her children, but now she saw the broader impact of her actions. She had become a part of something much bigger than herself. She was helping create a new legacy for her family, a legacy of resilience and justice, one that would be remembered for years to come. That evening, Lily stood outside, watching as neighbors gathered on the sidewalk, talking and laughing, no longer afraid to look each other in the eye. The silence of isolation had been broken, and in its place was a growing sense of unity. People weren't just talking about the changes they wanted to see. They were actively making them happen. She looked at James, who stood beside her, his face calm but resolute. Together, they had started something that couldn't be undone. "We've done it," Lily whispered, her voice filled with quiet pride. James smiled, his hand finding hers. "No, we're doing it, and we'll keep doing it." And for the first time in a long while, Lily felt a peace settle in her heart. The battle wasn't over, but they had won a crucial victory. It was a new beginning, not just for her family, but for Brookwood, too.